Good morning. Thank you for attending this morning's plenary event. I am Travis Huxman from the University of California, Irvine, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce the Scientific Interfaces plenary speaker this morning, Dr. Danielle Ignace. Dr. Ignace earned her undergraduate degree in zoology and environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she holds a master's and doctorate in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Arizona in Tucson. She is a plant physiological ecologist who's worked in a number of biomes throughout her career. I was lucky enough to have her as a member of my laboratory. In fact, she was the very first graduate student I recruited. She studies, in my lab, she studied the long and short-term dynamics of plant response to rainfall in the Sonoran Desert. Dr. Ignace is an exceptionally skilled and creative and insightful scholar. She and I collaborated during a time that I had small children. And I think that the best way that I can describe her is to simply say that I hoped my children would grow to gain the character, the kindness, the ethic, and the determination that I've watched Danielle employ. And now, as a past my peak faculty, after knowing her for 20 years, she's taught me something that seems self-evident. And that's that mentors learn more from their students than they could ever provide in return. And I'm grateful for that. Dr. Ignace carried out postdoctoral research with Peter Chesson, using her understanding of plant functional biology to understand diversity abundance patterns in communities. In 2012, she joined the faculty at Smith as an assistant professor and held a research affiliation at Harvard Forest, where she tackled questions of climate-induced vegetation change and ecosystem consequences. And she's recently joined the faculty of Forest and Conservation Science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She's completed several journeys back and forth across this continent. I'm excited today to hear about her journey as a scholar who's working to embrace the entirety of their being and to challenge approaches to science to make them more equitable and inclusive and impactful. It's rewarding and inspiring to watch someone grow with meaningful but disparate areas of scholarship, to embrace their identity and develop their research portfolio and watch it bloom into a single area of focus that suddenly has impact and identity. I find it courageous and passionate, and it's exciting. The title of her presentation is Making Meaningful Connections to Move Ecology Forward. And I can hear, and I'm sure Dr. Ignace appreciates, is the thundering virtual round of applause that you have just provided. Danielle.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Ecological Society of America for inviting me to give a plenary talk on scientific interfaces. It is an honor to be included with the other plenary speakers for this year's meeting. Thank you to Travis Huxman, my mentor and friend, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for joining me today virtually. I am joining you from the territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish on what is now known as Vancouver, British Columbia. And I invite you all to think about whose land you are joining from and consider how you could engage with those communities. Today, I'll take you on a journey of my 20+ years experience in academia and how the life lessons learned at each stage of that journey has influenced the connections that I've made and transformed my work as an ecologist. But to fully understand my perspective and where I'm coming from, I felt it was important to tell you about my background and my family. My grandfather is Raymond Ignace, a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe of Northern Idaho. My father is Gerald Ignace, also a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. My mother is Georgiana Ignace, a member of the Menominee tribe in Northern Wisconsin. I have 3 siblings, 2 older brothers, Glenn and Lyle, and an older sister, Tekla. And although we are enrolled members of the Coeur d'Alene tribe of Northern Idaho, we grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My parents really had a deep wish to leave a legacy of physicians devoted to enhancing healthcare for Native Americans in urban settings and supporting the Native American arts. But they also instilled a great motivation in us to not only be a voice, but an advocate for Native Americans when there are so few present in many different areas of expertise. So today I'd like to dedicate my plenary talk to my mother, Georgiana Ignace, who we lost a year and a half ago. I've also had a full circle moment with my father and his career, which was only fully realized recently. My father, having grown up in northern Idaho on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, really felt connected to the beautiful forest there, especially Douglas fir trees, and wanted to protect them and sustainably manage them. So to accomplish that, he became a smoke jumper. Wildly enough, he became a smoke jumper to help fight wildfires and therefore protect these forests. Unfortunately, he couldn't maintain his weight. It is such grueling work, as you can imagine, thus ending his days as a smoke jumper. Eventually, he became a physician specializing in internal medicine. And I asked him recently why he was a smoke jumper, and he said that he thought it was cool. And not that you know my father that well, but I don't think of him as so cool to do something as to become as a smoke jumper. So, but he made me realize that he always felt a strong connection to the forest and the plants there. And that if he wasn't a physician, that he would have been a forest manager. And so for me, having grown up, thinking I would be a physician as well, and having a strong aptitude for science and biology and medicine, and thought I would be a physician just like my father, and actually ended up being not a physician. As you can see, I'm a professor of forest ecology, but I came to love the forests just as he did, and also seek to protect them and sustainably manage them. So perhaps this is really a fulfillment of an unintentional legacy where we both wanted to stay connected to the forests and have that be our career. So similar to how my career is connected to my father's career, I feel a strong connection to the future generation of ecologists. And this is done through all these connections that I've made with science, and in particular, mentorship, accessibility, art and science, community, diversity, and whole self. So I will talk about all of these components in today's talk. I'll start by talking about mentorship. And here I really mean early mentorship. As we know, this stage can be so important for people or students from underrepresented groups and marginalized communities, not only if they start in ecology, but stay in ecology. So off I went to my undergrad years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I thought I would major in zoology and obtain all of my pre-med credentials and go off to med school. And of course, I received the very common advice, which was I needed to diversify my med school application in order to get into a really good medical school. So I sought out research opportunities. And my first research opportunity was in the vet school, grinding cow fecal samples and homogenizing liver samples. And in the end, this really wasn't for me as important as that work was. So I still continue to seek out different research opportunities. And I also was very interested in environmental studies and environmental issues. And I took an ecology course taught by Stanley Dotson. And he announced that he was looking for undergrads to join the lab and get involved in research. So I snapped up that opportunity as fast as I could and joined Stanley Dotson's ecotoxicology lab. And it was here where I met Dr. Donna Cashin, now a professor at Wayne State University. But at the time, she was working towards her PhD in Stanley Dotson's lab. But we became great friends. This was a great mentor-mentee relationship. And through all this work we did together, I really learned and loved the process of coming up with new research questions, developing experiments to test hypotheses, and would get really excited about the results. And we would use Daphnia magna as our study species from freshwater systems. So all of this was so fun, honestly, and I just knew that I wanted to become a professor simply based off of this fabulous mentorship. And this really led to the success of me being selected for the research experience for undergraduate summer program at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. At this time, I really thought I would go on to be a professor in ecotoxicology and work in freshwater systems. But this REU opportunity changed my life. And I never experienced Colorado or the mountains before. So I just fell in love with them. We would climb them on the weekends. I just fell in love with forests. This has really started my path to becoming the ultimate plant nerd. So I just really wanted to study big questions on the landscape level and think about how climate change impacted these landscapes. At the end of that summer, which was summer of 2000, quite a while ago, I attended my first ESA meeting, which was in Snowbird, Utah. And if you had told me then that I would have been invited to give a plenary talk for a future ESA meeting, I would not have believed you. So this was a transformative experience for me and really set me on my path to what I would eventually, spend my career working on. And I would run into the members of the Stanley Dotson Lab at other ESA meetings. And I still remember my last conversation with Stanley Dotson, and he was full of praise for the work I had done in the lab and the confidence that I gained after having the REU experience at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. So I'm really thankful for that conversation because that was soon before he unexpectedly passed away. And I had the privilege of working with my mentor, Donna Cashin, on a publication which was based off of my senior honors thesis work in the Stanley Dotson Lab, and we published a paper in tribute to Stanley Dotson. So it really was such a rare and privileged opportunity to write together with my mentor in tribute to her mentor. So this is such an important experience for me, and I'm not sure I would have been set on my path as to a professor if it were not for this great mentorship. And so I carried this with me to the next stage of going to grad school. And as you all know, grad school is a long haul, and there are far too many life lessons to talk about to fit within a 50-minute talk. But I'll talk about one that was probably the most impactful to me, which was talking about accessibility. So we were in a department of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona. And this time period was not only when we get to become, fluent in our area of expertise, and explore all the different ideas for the career we want. But we learn a lot of different things here too. And so the life lesson here for me was thinking about how we convey our science to the general public. And so through this work, I got my master's and my PhD at the University of Arizona, working in Travis Huxman's ecophysiology lab. And we worked in different ecosystems, primarily within the Sonoran Desert. I actually focused more on functional responses of native and invasive species to changes in precipitation in the Sonoran Desert. So this is where I really became fluent in the language and the tools and concepts of plant physiology. But if anyone has ever picked up a plant physiology textbook, some of them were really full of jargon, and it really took some time to become fluent in that language. And because we were in the ecology and evolutionary biology program, We were constantly learning from others in all areas of biology. So it was a constant lesson of trying to understand other areas of expertise. And I think because of that, Travis was really fabulous at encouraging us and pushing us to make sure that everyone understood our science, not just the other scientists in the department, but the general public. And so this was done through everything from abstract writing, manuscript writing, and all of our presentations. So we worked really hard to, take out what we knew in terms of the language of plant physiology and translate that for everyone. So based off of my work, there are some that really stuck with me over time. Doing pre-dawn water potential measurements as a plant physiologist. This is some of the units and the terminology that we had. Pre-dawn water potential of -6 megapascals, which we would translate to meaning plant water stratus, and that is stressed. That's a very dry plant. Similarly, I studied a lot of net assimilation rates. So thinking about how these different species take up CO2 during photosynthesis. So 20 micromoles of CO2 per meter squared per second. How did we translate that? Well, that essentially translated to photosynthesis, and that's happening at a high rate. There's also net ecosystem exchange, and these units were sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So a -5 micromoles of CO2 per meter squared per second would be translated to a breathing ecosystem that took in more CO2 than it released back out to the atmosphere. So these are just some of the examples and how hard we would work to translate our science for everyone. This brings me to the term ecosystem. And I thought a lot about how desert ecosystems were being impacted by changes in climate or pollution. And as often happens, either your friends or your family members ask what projects you are working on. My mother always asked what an ecosystem was. And through all my years of training at this point, from my undergrad to my graduate school years, I think I had an intuitive sense what an ecosystem was, but was rarely faced with having to define it for someone. So I tried every way I could think of to define an ecosystem for my mother, and she never understood. And I never took it to mean that she wasn't smart enough. It was more that I could not find a way to communicate this to her. So I fell back to some of the textbooks that were incredibly important for me at the time. And this one in particular, Principles of Terrestrial Ecosystem Ecology. And if you flip through to the back, you'll find ecosystem defined as ecological system consisting of all the organisms in an area and the physical environment with which they interact. This makes sense to me, and I tried to reiterate this and find different ways to explain this to my mother, and it never quite took off. So I consider this one of my greatest failures as a scientist, that I couldn't do this. But one day my mother called me and was so excited and said, I finally understand what an ecosystem is. And it's not because I suddenly became better at explaining it to her. It's because she read an article from the National Geographic on a flight. So I never did catch the article that she found in the National Geographic on routes to somewhere, but I'm glad she finally discovered what it was, that National Geographic could deliver something that I couldn't. So again, I consider this one of my greatest failures as a scientist. So this lesson I've carried with me through my teaching over the years. And in the first day of my global change ecology or my ecophysiology course, the first lesson that we cover in that course is let's define an ecosystem. And this is simply because I want to make sure that I help the future generation of ecologists not make the same failure as I did. There are also a lot of fun ways to, create a sense of accessibility in the work that we do. I think those years in graduate school working with Travis and being pushed to really find ways that make our science palatable to the general public. I've found new ways to make that happen with my students. And so that kicked off a series called Meet the Ignace Lab, which really meant meet everyone who's involved in my lab and let's hear from the students themselves. And so we started a YouTube channel. Some of it's goofy, some of it's more scientific than others. So we really had a lot of fun creating these videos. And this is not at all about me directing them. This is truly a collaborative effort with the students. And I think we can agree, if you're a field person, you have so much fun when you're in the field. If you add this dimension to your field site, I promise you one of the funnest days you'll ever have with your lab group. So it does take some different tries to film yourself or film the group on for a YouTube video. Maybe someday I'll release the bloopers because it's actually really funny. So this was a great opportunity for students to learn how to increase the accessibility of their work and in their own words. And because of this, having felt that I maybe had failed in the past in making my work accessible, and then that having drove me to be even more of an advocate for increasing accessibility of science and our work, I really still wanted to seek out other ways to make new connections for this process. And so that led to what some of you might view as an unusual combination of art and science, in particular, this case, art and biology. And as I mentioned, as I teach in my my courses on plant physiology, ecophysiology, intro to biology, I was finding myself carrying with me those lessons I learned in grad school and trying to explain things to a broad audience, a broad set of students that have different learning styles. So I'm a very visual learner, and I want to, I guess, find as many different diagrams and visualizations as I can to help be inclusive of different learning styles. So when I started teaching introductory to biology, well, as you can imagine, that's a very big class. There's so many different topics that are covered, everything from components inside a cell to complex processes like photosynthesis or respiration. And so I would scour the internet looking for all the different ways to visualize a process or visualize something abstract and tiny, like what is inside a cell. So I would often find myself apologizing to my students in class because I couldn't find a visualization or a diagram that properly conveyed in a clear way what the process was. So that really was troubling to me, and I felt like I wanted to help do something about that. Well, at the same time, I was advising a lot of biology students who had a strong art background. And I think as many might see, that as students progress through college and think about what they're going to do after they graduate, I think some felt the pressure to choose the more lucrative biology major over an art major. And because I was apologizing to my students in class for not having found a good enough diagram, I shifted to saying, please don't give up your art talent in biology. We need you. So this really led to me thinking about different ways to combine the two, art and science, in particular art and biology. So this led to a pilot project at Smith College, and I really wanted to find a way to merge these two areas and try to convey something complicated such as climate change. So not going to lie, it took a while to find a partner, a professor who was willing to work with a professor in STEM on this project, but I did find Dr. Lindsay Clark-Ryan in the art department. And so I'm very grateful that she wanted to take a chance and collaborate with someone in STEM on this kind of a project. So Dr. Clark-Ryan brought advisee Melissa Temple, an art major. I brought advisee Zoe Morel, a biology major. There was really no restrictions on this project, except it had to be about climate change. So as you can imagine, all the ideas start floating, and when you don't have any restrictions or rules, you can kind of stall on what the project or the focus could be. So we just started talking about issues in ecology, issues in climate change. And I relayed a story. One of the biggest issues I feel that's happening still today is inclusion or representation of maybe underrepresented organisms or ideas. And I relayed a story to them that from the past several years, having my students and I work on studying the photosynthetic rate of understory species in northeastern forests. And some of the work was deemed by someone as insignificant, despite our results demonstrating that actually some of these species with really high abundances in the understory actually had really high photosynthesis. So this led to me feeling that I needed to be an advocate for understory species in northeastern forests. And this kind of went tangent and led to a discussion thinking about different organisms like moss and other bryophytes and how they're understudied, yet they have a very important functional role in ecosystems and are sensitive to climate change. So it became kind of like a merging of underdogs, understory species, understudied or undervalued organisms and ideas in forest ecology. And this is really what steered the project to what it is today. So the students took birch plywood, laser cut it to represent the Mount Holyoke Range in Western Massachusetts, and took moss that was already in place in the Botanic Garden at Smith College, and then attached it to the different elevations on the Mount Holyoke Range here. And this was supposed to represent the changes in moss coverage as we get more changes in climate. And in a way, this is representing how moss can kind of be on an escalator to extinction, but it might also go unnoticed by scientists because they're so understudied and perhaps a little undervalued. So this is a living art installation. I believe it survived the pandemic and is still thriving at the Botanic Garden. It is also placed under the bench in the Botanic Garden here. So yet another example of how kind of an underutilized space can be used for something like this. And this really was a beautiful merger of art and biology through two different professors and two different students that brought their different talents and knowledge to the table. So I really view this also as a beautiful representation of how we can communicate to the general public in a visual display of art and science. Word got around about this project, and other students, you'd be surprised how many biology students have an art background, and they wanted to do their own take on this type of project. So a lot of them came with drawings or paintings, and I'm going to show you one example of a figure from one of my papers with Peter Chesson, published several years ago. And this is work based off of my postdoc work in the Chihuahuan Desert. And this figure, which was part of the publication, shows the relative abundance of the 6 most abundant native species in a Chihuahuan Desert ecosystem. And this includes several decades of abundances. It also represents, in the mid-1990s, an eruption of an invasive species, Erodium secutarium, and thus having an impact on the abundances of these native species. At the same time, at the start of this data set and at the end of towards the end of the data set, we saw a shift in the rodent species that eat the seeds of these plants. So it switched from the kangaroo rats to the smaller pocket mouse. So I love this figure. I love colors. I love playing with data visualizations. So we came up with this particular figure, and the different colors or the widths of the colors represent the abundances of these different species. However, this didn't translate that well. When I use this in my teaching, I was still having students struggle a bit to kind of translate this. And so this became a really great model for a student to take the challenge of translating this in an artistic way. So Hannah Rappaport, one of the students in my lab, made this beautiful watercolor painting. This image, the slide does not do the painting justice. It's quite large, it's bright and beautiful, but I think it does a great job of taking snapshots of the data and showing the differences in the abundances over time. And so here, over the same timestamp of 1988 through early 2000s, you can see the changes in the rodent community. So went from, on the left, the kangaroo rat to the right, having shown the change to the pocket mouse. And then at different time spans in 1988, 1998, and 2008, you can see the differences in the proportion of the species that are found there. So I thought this was a really beautiful representation in how you can transform a complicated data set to something that's quite beautiful. So these lessons of being accessible and translating science in an accessible way still carry with me today. I'm still always exploring different ways that you can do this. And I highly encourage everyone to engage with your students to come up with new ways to discover this, as I found this to be some of the most fulfilling ways to relate to the students. So next I want to talk about community, and there are different ways to define community. In ecology, we often think about all of the species that are present in a particular area. And I certainly did study that quite a bit in my years as a postdoc, again, at the University of Arizona. I worked with Peter Chesson in his theoretical ecology lab. So we worked near Portal, Arizona, in a Chihuahuan desert ecosystem. Again, these are, there was a beautiful set of native winter annual plants that used to be present there. And then we had an eruption of an invasive species, Erodium secutarium. So we did a lot of great work, a lot of great projects in this beautiful area of Arizona, thinking about how the community changes and what led to those changes. One, it was the eruption of this invasive species, its climate change, its nitrogen deposition, and it's also those rodent species that have a big impact on the annual plant community. So there's no time to discuss all of the results from this, but this time I took a really valuable, or actually two valuable lessons with me. One was that invasive species often have a bad meaning, in that they're often viewed as detrimental. And there's a lot of work showing that's true. But at the same time, we were finding that there actually could be some positives to an invasive species. And in this case, we found that it had a very positive and perhaps a facilitative relationship with at least one of the native species here. Not only that, but if we think about on a community level, it increased the biomass of this system, and therefore increases the ability to capture carbon. So here is where I really learned a valuable lesson about how we view invasive species and what their value and role could be in various ecosystems. This time was also transformative for me in a way that I thought about a different kind of community. So not just communities of plants, but the actual community or the local community. And I just happened to meet a friend of my mother's, as I mentioned. She's very active in the Native American arts. And I just happened to meet a friend of hers who was involved in this organization in Tucson, Arizona, Native Seed Search. And they were seeking someone with exactly my kind of background, being Native American, having a science degree, and also being, in a sense, a plant nerd. So I could understand some of the mission and the science of what they were doing. So this is a wonderful organization. They have a mission to protect all the diversity of the crops in these arid lands. So they really are this large seed bank to protect arid adapted seeds of the Southwest. So they have a lot of different activities they do, from not only being a seed bank, but distributing seeds, not just to the general public, but they have a really special plan where they interact with the Native Americans and make sure that they have access to seeds. They also have a lot of different community garden projects and community learning workshops. So lots of different facets to this organization. It's important to talk about why perhaps I was a good fit to serve on the board of directors for this organization. You can see here some of the beautiful diversity. This is just a snapshot of 2,000 varieties that they hold within the seed bank. A lot of it beans, squash, and corn. And the founders really had a special relationship with the indigenous communities of the area. So this really started by conversations, listening, and learning that the members of the local indigenous community were actually looking for the seeds that their grandparents used to grow. And so not only was the organization looking for seeds so they could preserve them, but the indigenous community wanted to also preserve their seeds because there were so many cultural traditions that were being encompassed within a seed. So that relationship 36 years ago merged and grew, and so they really transformed, I think, this organization to what it is today, a huge seed bank that preserves all this genetic diversity as well as cultural traditions. And I was on the board and eventually led efforts to develop a code of ethics that helps the organization relate to the indigenous communities. And how do we protect those cultural traditions? How do we protect the seeds as a food source and make sure that it's a respectful and reciprocal relationship? And it's important to note here that we thought a lot about the science of like making sure that these were viable seed banks. And if we think about the original keepers of these seeds and these indigenous communities and all of their knowledge, well, for many generations, they knew exactly what to do, right? They understood the environment and what environmental conditions were needed for proper germination, growth, and establishment of a lot of these different species. And they had their own ways of preserving seeds in jars, which is a little bit different from the freezers and the seed banks that we use today. But I really consider these knowledge holders the original scientists, even though Western science may not necessarily give them that distinction. So this work was really transformative for me into thinking about what is community? How do we take our science and interact with the community in a meaningful way? And this was really important for me to think about issues about climate change and as well as food security. And now we've realized that so many of the predictions we had long ago about how climate would change and impact our society are not only coming true, but perhaps at a faster rate than we had predicted. So this is a time when we not only need to make sure these indigenous communities have the resources to, keep food insecurity away, but it's also important that they need access to data and understanding the science and what's happening, what kind of results and experiments are we finding. So, in the time of such dramatic changes in climate and issues with food security, it's never been more important to make sure that they have access to all of this. So that time was really important to me in realizing that my work was relevant, not just for science itself, but it was relevant to the community and that I could really do something here. And eventually I wanted to think a little bit more about diversity. So as I mentioned, I thought about what species are present in a particular community, expanded to what my idea of what community was, but also thinking about diversity. And of course, in ecology, we think about species diversity, biological diversity. So this has really guided a lot of research efforts. We have decades of fascination by ecologists on what drives the diversity we see in a given system, and in turn, what does diversity do, or how is it connected to different ecosystem processes and ecosystem function? And this, in fact, was really important to how I got started in grad school. I read many papers, and these were just a snapshot of some of the papers that were incredibly important to me and influential in how I thought about what I wanted to study as in my career. And so these are just a few of those. And we still have not given up the fascination with questions related to diversity and biodiversity and how they impact plant communities and ecosystem function. Those are different kind of diversity that warrant special attention. And that's the diversity represented on this slide. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is simply a snapshot of the people from underrepresented and marginalized communities whose voices have historically been excluded or erased from many dialogues in science. What we have to gain from their values, perspectives, expertise, and ways of knowing is immeasurable. Additionally, we can move beyond the peer-reviewed publications that dominate Western science to include diverse forms of audio, video, writings, storytelling, and art. Finally, the work that people do for diversity and inclusion should be supported and valued, especially as it pertains to success and evaluation throughout science. I'll share an anecdote with you from the past several years as I moved through my career in science. I show here a section of my older CV that shows some of my ancient work of graduate student leadership, being a coordinator, a grad student representative. And I also show my work that I did with native seed search. This work I'm very proud of. It expanded what I do as a scientist, especially relating and working with Indigenous communities. I was advised to delete my work with native seed search, and unfortunately, I did it. I deleted it from my CV. The irony is not lost on me that I spent a good portion of my career measuring and understanding how carbon is assimilated in plants and ecosystems. And here I was working so hard to assimilate in a standard Western science world. So this remains one of my greatest regrets in science. And the advice I received was to delete this part of me in my work. It was a small act, but an impactful one. I'm happy to say that as I've grown to be more confident and want to show my work and be unwavering in how important it is, I've put the work back on my CV. Once again, a small act, but an impactful one. So I'll end this section of the talk by asking a simple question. Why not value diverse ways of knowing, perspectives, and expertise while we try to solve the world's most pressing environmental problems? Isn't what we have to gain by including these values and perspectives much more powerful than if we excluded them? So I've come this far in the talk without really telling you about the framework of my science. And I'll share that with you now. I try to answer one main question: how does global change affect ecosystem function? I study various global change factors, including invasive pests, invasive plants, and big changes in climate, such as drought and increases in temperature. These together can impact ecosystems that are in transition. As of lately, I've been studying in particular eastern hemlock forests that transition to black birch forests. I try to understand as much as I can about the below ground factors of soil organic layer development, nutrient cycling, bacterial and fungal diversity. I also try to understand as much as I can about the above ground components of leaf litter and biomass. I also think about the CO2 fluxes and how much CO2 gets fixed during photosynthesis and how much CO2 goes back out to the atmosphere via respiration. Taken together, these tell me about net ecosystem exchange and how these ecosystems in transition take in or release CO2 and what the balance of that is like. And that if we lose more CO2 to the atmosphere, that this will in turn impact global warming and therefore contribute to future climate change. But what's missing from this framework is the community. And I have not been able to bring my whole self to the work I do. And that is primarily because I haven't felt the space to include my identity as a Native American in science, as well as the work that I do with Indigenous communities. So only until recently have I felt the space to do that. And recently I've developed a project at Harvard Forest. Harvard Forest was established in 1907, but of course there is a very long history well before that. And Harvard Forest is located on the territory of the Nipmuc Nation. So this work aims to work with the Nipmuc community, build a respectful and reciprocal relationship, start early in working with them to co-produce and collaborate on projects, increase access and accessibility of science, recenter Indigenous ways of knowing, especially as it pertains to land use and forest management, and more importantly, include a great diversity of expertise, different levels of degrees, as well as many members of the community as we possibly can. So this includes students, experts, scholars, and artists, and many members of the Nipmuc community. To do this, I established collaboration with Megan Graham-McLean, Marissa Weiss, and we started this project and to include it in the Harvard Forest Summer REU program. This led us to finding two fabulous students, Faith Blalock and Rafa Viana Furrer. And as a group, we really bring our shared experiences, new experiences, and really have the same passions and goals in working with the Indigenous community. This has been our world for the past year, a very virtual world. We are spread out very far. We've never met in person. So we are spread out between Massachusetts, Minnesota, Vancouver, British Columbia, as well as Hawaii. So we've been very separated spatially, but I've never felt more connected intellectually or emotionally on such an important project. And I'm often asked what it takes to start a project like this and work with the local Indigenous community. And what I can say is that there's no one way to do it. There's no one template or set of guidelines in which to achieve meaningful relationships. But what I can say is that for us, this is what it looked like, and that we as collaborators started this year with many meetings taken together. It amounts to approximately 100 hours of meetings virtually. This does not include the extra webinars, panel discussions, workshops, emails, and readings that we've done. Once we had our RE students join us for the summer, they have their standard 40-hour work weeks as part of the summer program. In addition, we meet as a group at this point for approximately 40 hours of meetings. Many scientists will say that when they leave the office or the lab and they go home, that their work never quite ends and their minds never quite shut off from what they do. And this is exactly how we feel, in that we live and breathe this project. All of this work in thinking and meetings and self-reflection, though, is all before we attempted to establish building new relationships with the Indigenous community. So this is just one way, this is our way of how we've started this process. And I can say that we're at the beginning. And even though we have students that are temporary with us through the Harvard Forest Summer REU program, that our work will continue. And we are only at the beginning of building these relationships. I began my talk today relaying stories and lessons learned with early mentorship, and how essential that was for me to start and stay in ecology. And then went through my stories about the connections I made in accessibility, art and science, community, and diversity. But I only feel that I've come full circle because I've been able to include my whole self and identity in the work that I do. And so through mentorship, I can now bring my full self to maximize my potential to mentor the next generation of ecologists. And they no doubt will have their own journey to go through and their lessons learned in the different connections that make, but we will all forever be connected in this way. There are far too many people to thank. I'll start by acknowledging my mentors throughout the years: Donna Cashin, Stanley Dotson during my undergraduate years, Neo Martinez for my REU at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, my PhD mentor, Travis Huxman, my postdoc mentor, Peter Chesson. Everyone else on these slides have inspired me, supported me, and collaborated with me in such wonderful ways that they deserve special acknowledgement here, in addition to other organizations and Harvard Forest and UBC for giving me the space to be my whole self in the work that I do. Brian Paul Johnson and I collaborated in all the graphics that you see on the slides today. And I want to give a special acknowledgement to Meg, Marissa, Faith, Rafa, and two members of the Nipmuc Nation, Nia Hawley and Kristen Wyman. The work that we've done so far as a group is just the beginning in what is a tremendous healing process for me. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Danielle. That was a wonderful talk, and I appreciate you telling your whole story. And I found it emotionally challenging to listen to parts of it. I found it inspiring for other parts of it, and it really, brought back also lots of memories and feelings, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience did too. And I'm starting to get questions. But I want to start just really quickly and ask you about, I wouldn't call your inclusion, one of someone who's a first generation student who I am most experienced with in terms of thinking about inclusion. But yet there's like some interesting sort of parallels between your experience, this kind of separation or pushing from family, like the sort of a tension between training for a profession versus training for your interests and your skills and your aptitudes, and then how that results in sort of this relationship with your mother about what is it you're doing, and what are definitions, and then also though her clear investment in your career, right? I mean, she clearly was someone who inspired you to do new things that were impactful and important. And so I just wonder, have you thought about these barriers, and especially in the context of how we're building inclusion in academia, recruiting people and saying, we want your voice, but at the same time, like promoting them losing their voice and having to reinvent the wheel of feeling comfortable to include it in who they are.
How do we do that? Yeah. I think it takes many people to, I think, be inclusive and kind of be welcoming in that way. I think asking the questions, listening, to experiences, and being okay with that, whether it's difficult or not in terms of those experiences. Having grown up, whether it's societal or family-based issues, and so I think just being welcoming and listening and supportive, I think, is one of the best ways we can do that. And yes, there still is this issue of having to be fluent in the language of what our specialty is, yet still not losing yourself at the same time. So I think for me it was compartmentalized, and so I think for me moving forward, it's I'll certainly try not to do that with any of the students in my lab.
So this first question relates directly to this, and I'll read it. So it's their words. The story about getting advice to take some of your most impactful work out of your CV was painful to hear, and I agree with that. How would you recommend students and early career scientists shape their CVs and their professional identities to also encompass not just their scholarship, but the impact on communities and societies as well? So what is there something tangible around that you can provide some advice forward?
I think it's so important, and this took me a while too, because I think even being in your lab and we craft CVs that try to get a postdoc or a faculty job. Even we think about it's a lot of bean counting, right? And I think there's the classic way of counting publications and kind of compartmentalizing those into in prep or in review or in resubmission and things like that. And it's taken me a while to, I guess, recondition myself to think about what is useful. And honestly, one of the ways I did this was, having almost left academia, the CV is a very special crafted document for academia. And I took my CV and tried to translate it. Okay, I teach this, but I can code in R. Might that be good for a data analysis, type of job? Or, there are different, I think, tangible things that we get trained on in whether, no matter where you are in the step of your progress in academia. And so I think it's being able to translate that there are a lot of useful things, even though it may not be counted as a bean on your CV, that there are a lot of useful things there. So I think when you look at the classes that you take, that if you do create any kind of graphs, even if it's Excel, I'm always going to push R and RStudio, but those are very useful things. So I think it's really taking a hard look at your courses, what courses you've taken. Did you volunteer somewhere? That's important information. Did you create a piece of artwork or get involved in a podcast or videos? I think these are really important skills that I think have been overlooked. And it's taken me a while to recondition myself, but it does, I happy to look at someone's CV. I want to send it my way. But yeah, I think we're taught in a way to think about numbers of these things, and when there's a much broader way to look at what you do.
Great. And so along those lines, the next question is about science and art. And so it's great to hear about your collaboration between biology and arts on how to represent stories about climate change. How important do you think such collaborations are to communicate scientific work to the larger community?
I think it's incredibly important. if we want to expand our reach, I think that's going to be one of the biggest ways, right? And I think people often view that there is no connection between art and science or art and biology, and I think there's a huge connection. And in the same way that I think people think creativity isn't in science, I've always felt that creativity was a big reason why some of my projects took off, or why, you know, experiments were designed in a certain way. If you kind of put on more of the creative cap than kind of a rigid cap to it. So I think expanding that reach, all different forms of artwork, different places too. So not just a botanic garden and not just higher ed institute. Think about K through 12, you know, projects involving the youth. I think that's a great place to start, and not just museums, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways to display art and create art that's informative.
So along those lines, you know, you're speaking to a bunch of scientists for the most part. And so one question is, I'd love to be part of an art and science collaboration, but I'm not sure how to start. So do you have advice? How'd you begin? We all know how to begin a new research project, or we think we do. But how do you begin a project like this?
Yeah, and I think I touched on it just a little bit in the talk. And I've been, like I mentioned, I've been thinking about it for a while, and it really involved cold calling someone. And I think that's a scary thing to do, right? Just to email someone out of the blue and ask if they want to collaborate on something, or even have a meeting. But I think it's time to kind of, you know, not be so shy anymore. And I just happened to be at a workshop. The Botanic Garden had a workshop looking for new projects or new ways of thinking, and it really was no restrictions on it. And I noticed that there were a lot of folks from the art museum there, and I thought it was a great opportunity. So I had to ask around. It wasn't the first person I asked. I think you know, one person was very receptive, and then kind of helped me navigate to find someone who was willing to work with me. So I think you'd be surprised how many people are interested in doing this kind of work. So it's not easy to cold call or cold email someone, but I think that is a first step. Or if there is some sort of event on campus or events locally, just start a conversation with someone and ask if they'd be interested.
Great. So here's another question. Thanks for a super interesting talk. Hindsight is a gift, as it's often said. The way your terrific career took off and has been maintained seems logical when examined retrospectively. For example, you know, I did A and that led to B, which then spinned off to C. However, what pivotal moment would you say has single-handedly shaped who you are as an ecologist?
Wow. That is such a huge question. I'll give a recent example. And that is, gosh, let's see. It was certainly during the pandemic. I almost left academia altogether. I you know, like I said, I took my CV and started translating it and thinking, what else is there? And I had conversations with a lot of people. It's funny when you kind of come through, and as an ecologist, you hear a lot from different folks in different businesses that, oh, an environmental consultant, you would be really good at that and you can find that easily. And it turns out that's not the case. So it was really interesting things like that I'd find out in kind of all of my interactions and meetings with people to try to find what the next career was. At the same time, I was asked for my Indigenous perspective to give a webinar, you know, about climate change. So Indigenous voices on climate change. And so that was a year and a half ago, or gosh, yeah, it seems like a long time ago. So I just interviewed for a job earlier that day. And then I gave the webinar, and then through the Q&A session, I realized I wasn't done. So it came at a pivotal time, I think, with you know, everything that was going on in the world and society, that folks seemed to want to hear the Indigenous perspective. I think finally, I didn't think I'd ever get to the point where people would ask for it. So that was, I would say, most recently, the most important day, one of the most important days of my career, which was interviewing for a job, realizing maybe it's not the right fit, and then realizing people still wanted to hear my perspective as an Indigenous person. And just, I think, having a gut feeling that I wasn't done. So, and that realizing that I had a different, a different career goal in mind to stay.
Wow, I think that's really inspiring, Danielle. Like, I mean, I think I said to introduce you that one of the things that inspired me about you was your determination. And so clearly, you kept that throughout your career, these last 20 years, this ability to do the hard thing. I'm going to switch and talk about then sort of moments early on. So clearly the REU experience was important to you early. And, there's a question about are REUs, remunerated for their 40 hours of work. And I just like you to talk about your perspective of that REU experience, the compensation, the costs, your experience at it, knowing it was 20 years ago. But still, it's probably had a long impact, the good and the bad.
Right. So you're asking what's the value of it, or did I feel like I got compensated enough as a student? Well,
it's this there. I mean, the question is about, are they compensated appropriately, effectively? And, I think you can think about that in lots of ways, in terms of cash and support. Clearly you took long-term career, value from it, but what were there downsides? Was the downsides about cash? Was the downsides about other kinds of support? Were there other positives that I'm not thinking about?
I mean, it was a great experience for me. I think value-wise, I guess I always think about summer programs, working a lot with students in summer research programs, whether it's an REU or through the various institutions I've been at. The value, like the dollar value, I always think is too low. And so how do we, if we think about a budget, how do we budget for that? Fewer, but higher, or try to get more money and more students? How do we, I think it's a tough balance to maximize the number of students you can impact through this program, any program, or do you have fewer and a higher, stipend? So I think, so certainly I'm going to advocate for more for value-wise in that way. But I think, I think the landscape has changed for these programs. Even being involved with Harvard Forest REU program, there's more, I guess, training. I think there weren't that many REUs when I had an REU experience, and now there's so many. So, and I think, they're all very different. So I think choosing one that, I think maximizes training, like Harvard Forest, for example, maximizes, getting, if you don't know R, you'll certainly get to know R or R Studio in that. So I think, and there's also, creative ways, more creative things that are being implemented in some of these programs. I think the value of that is incredible. And I think if the relationships are maintained, and still friends with my REU mentor. So I think those are important. These are people that are important for writing letters of recommendation or helping you get introduced to someone at a meeting. So I think they're so important.
Thank you. Okay, so there's another question. I would like to know what advice you would give to a young ecologist in the making that would like to get involved with science communication.
Yeah, this is interesting because I think I said in the talk that in a way you were helping us to be good science communicators in grad school. We didn't really call ourselves that, and at the time it just wasn't a thing, right? So I think pushing yourself to, or practicing how you can communicate your work to everyone is super important. How do you get involved in that? Honestly, I just wanted to do videos. I just wanted to start, I started getting into podcasts, and then I started one, but then of course I left Smith. So I had to, I had to drop that one, but I certainly picked that up when I have the first opportunity to do that. And I just thought it would be fun, to be honest. So I think it takes training. I actually, there are lots of, it's funny, if you'll find tons of YouTube videos on how to create a YouTube channel. So it's, there's certainly no shortage of videos and tutorials that are out there. I don't have a good resource necessarily on hand for, or if you want to learn how to do this, here's this resource in this website, and here's this workshop or training course. I kind of just winged it, to be honest. So I think do whatever sounds super fun to you. And you don't necessarily need super expensive equipment. iPhone or smartphone have great cameras these days. So everyone seems to be a vlogger, right?
Talking with your mother is a good way to become a science communicator. It was the same with mine.
I tried.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about the early experience, because to me it was that's an important time in my career too. So it was interesting, and I want to know what worked and didn't work for supporting you early in your career to be who you are. So I, was a new assistant professor, and I didn't understand how universities worked. And I had just had my identity trained out of me in graduate school. And so, how is it that you were able to come around and embrace your complete identity? Because it seems like we did everything possible to remove it from you.
Gosh. Oh, Travis, that is a gut-wrenching statement.
Yeah, that's my experience, and that's listening to your story. It feels like even though I was even though I tried as much as I could, I was, the system and I were not, we're not in a position to support you to be who you were. So.
Yeah, and I think it was hard to kind of convey a couple of things in the talk, which is that I look back and I'm definitely, because we had a great mentor-mentee relationship, and so many great experiences in grad school in that realm. I don't look back and think, gosh, Travis Huxman really kept me from being myself. That is so not at all how I view it. And the way I view it is that I think science in general, or ecology in general, it just wasn't to me a place where I could see that I could bring everything. So I think the training I received from you and the lab was incredible. I've often thought about that. If I had asked, you, or in my postdoc years, if I really wanted to do this work with, the local indigenous groups, I'm pretty sure you would have been great with that. So I think I don't view it as that you would have prevented me from doing that work if I wanted to. It's just that I didn't think it was acceptable, and that's an issue of the field in general, the science in general, and the field in general. I didn't see a role model out there. I'm not saying that they didn't exist, but I think in our very specific world of ecophysiology and what we were doing, I just didn't see that was an accepted thing to do. And so I just didn't think that there was room or space for it. And I think, you in your position as a mentor, probably didn't see that either, right? It's like, oh, what forest or what grassland are we going to work in? Not what communities are we going to also work with?
It's very true. Okay, so here's another question for you. Inspiring presentation, Danielle. What question or questions are you most excited to work on before next year's ESA meeting? What are the things you're on your plate?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm currently in Vancouver, so I'm I am excited to get to know everyone here. I just moved here, 10 days ago. We finally got furniture a couple days ago. So that's exciting. So I'm really excited to get to know the Indigenous community here and all the different organizations. I think there's a great amount of support here that I've noticed so far already. So I'm excited to explore what local projects I can do. My Harvard Forest work, I left, New England, but that's never going to go away for me. So it is unfortunate that having kind of built up these amazing connections and relationships and then having to move. But we're in a virtual world right now, and it seems to be going very well virtually. So, certainly building, just we're at the start. I feel like we've done great work, but we're just at the start of, forming this and building a great relationship, in my opinion, with the Nipmuc Nation. So that's there's no easy plan to that. So it sounds like I don't know what I want to do. But it's more that it's co-production in that. So it's I have ideas of what would be cool, but I think that very much needs to be co-produced in a collaborative effort. So I think what we decide as a group is, that'll be most exciting to me. But we're certainly thinking about relationality. So on land, kind of reconnecting to different species that are culturally important, and economically, agriculturally important, and thinking about how everything is kind of impacted by climate change. Can we have a climate adaptation, management program or a sustainable management program?
Excellent. Very good. So here's another question for you. Thanks for a great talk. I often find that students are not used to thinking at the ecosystem scale in terms of carbon and nutrient cycling. What are some of the best definitions of ecosystem that you and your students or your mother have come up with that resonated with others?
I was just looking at, as the talk was going, I thought maybe I'll look up the National Geographic definition. It actually is really great. Like I said, I never did catch that article that my mom found that was so enlightening to her on a flight somewhere. So maybe I was mad about it, jealous that National Geographic did what I couldn't do. Yeah, I don't have so many. I've taught a lot of students in plant physiology, ecophysiology, and global change. So I can't remember a lot of the definitions. They were all really great, but I like the National Geographic definition, which was thinking about a geographical area that has all the plants, animals, and other organisms, working with weather and landscape in a bubble. So that to me, like that kind of sets the stage, this abstract part of ecosystems. Where do they begin? Where do they end? A lake, I think, is an easy way to envision an ecosystem, but the ecosystems that we're used to working with, it's hard to define them. But if we think about things in a bubble, that makes sense to me.
Did you ever talk about why you have the term exists with your mom?
No.
Instead of what?
What was that?
Instead of what it is, but why?
I think we never really had that dialogue. I think it was more, why are you measuring leaf level gas exchange? What is the light course 6400? Why are you using that to measure photosynthetic rate?
So here's another question for you. From a Native American perspective, do you have any recommendations for how Western science can integrate traditional ecological knowledge?
Gosh, yeah, I think one of the most important ways to do that is to have the hard conversations. And I think, gosh, it takes time. Right. I think it does take asking, not just me, but many others. And again, it gets back to maybe the cold calling or setting up an cold email and say, hey, can we meet even just for, 20, 30 minutes? Or I really value your perspective. I'd like to hear or learn more about it. So it does involve, I think, getting uncomfortable and hearing about, horrific past and erasure, exclusion. It does, I think, entail listening to those experiences and having the hard conversations. So I think that's part of it. I think broadening the lens or having multiple lenses in which you read or value science, or the different ways of knowing in projects is really important. And if there's research that kind of directly aims to dismantle cultural paradigm, I think that's incredibly problematic. So I think that's not the perspective we're looking for. We're looking to broaden, not dismantle.
That's a good answer. And I had just received a 2-minute warning, so this is a perfect sort of ending, except to note that even you and I, it's hard because even you and I haven't talked about these things, and we have a relationship that's a good collaboration. And so if we haven't done it, it's hard in general, I think.
Yeah, you have to make time for it, and we're all so busy. So
yeah. Thank you, Danielle. This was a wonderful talk and a great question and answer, and I'm so grateful that you got to tell your story.
Thank you to the Ecological Society of America for inviting me in the first place, and thank you, Travis. Certainly made me tear up listening to your introduction.
Thanks.
Please feel free to email me questions, and everyone.
I will.